Okay, so we have our first keynote tonight as the opening speaker, Nishat Awan, who will be introduced by our discussant, Monica Basbous. So I would like to present Monica first, and then she'll take care of the rest. Monica is a friend and a frequent collaborator. So that's how I'm going to start. And she is a multidisciplinary researcher and educator trained in architecture and critical media studies. Using various forms and media, her work is concerned with how power is negotiated through the production of space, time, knowledge, bodies, and their representations. She has taught at the Lebanese American University and at the American University of Beirut, and has a decade-long research experience around questions of urban planning and informality, mobility in public space, housing rights, and environmental justice in Lebanon. Her recent writings were published in the Architectural Review 2021, Journal Makan 2023, Middle East Critique 2023, JIM 2024, and Weird Economies 2024. She is currently a doctoral researcher at the Universitat Pompeu Fabra in Barcelona. Did I say that correctly? Welcome, Monica.
Thank you, Ahmed. It's a pleasure to be here. Please join me in welcoming Nishat. Nishat Awan's research focuses on the intersection of geopolitics and space, including questions related to diasporas, migration, and border regimes. She's interested in modes of spatial representation, particularly in relation to the digital and the limits of witnessing as a form of ethical engagement with distant places. Her book, Diasporic Agencies, 2016, addressed the subject of how architecture and urbanism can respond to the consequences of increasing migration. She has also addressed alternative modes of architectural production in the co-authored book, Spatial Agency, 2011, and the co-edited book, Translocal Act, 2011. Her work has been exhibited at the New Institute, Istanbul Biennale, Busan Museum of Modern Art, Yorkshire Sculpture Park, among others. She is Professor of Architecture and Visual Culture at UCL Urban Lab. Welcome, Nishat.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you for the invitation. It's really nice to be here and to share a space with you all. I just want to start by thanking the organizers. I know there have been a lot of thank yous, but thank you for having us, especially in the current moment. I think City Debates is a kind of is a conference that all of us in architecture and urbanism really look forward to, but this year it's particularly important. So thank you, Ahmed, for curating such a great event, and also thank you to the Beirut Urban Lab and to AUB. So this is a talk that's based around a long-term project that I've been conducting called Topological Atlas, which really has two main components. The first one is that it is a project that looks at migration and displacement. So we've been doing a lot of field work in Pakistan and in Turkey, and also working at the Pakistan-Iran border and at the Iran-Turkey border. Lots of interviews, workshops, conversations in the field, etc. And then the other aspect of the project, which somehow is a methodological one and overlaps with the themes of this conference, is that we've been thinking about mapping and using mapping and forms of spatial analysis to understand the production of contemporary borders and then the experience of crossing them without papers. So the way that I suppose we've approached mapping within this project is related to, I suppose, my long-term interest in bringing together the digital bringing an affective dimension to the digital, let's say. And within this particular project, it has been through a lot of ethnographic work, as I just mentioned. But I suppose it's a difficult thing, it was mentioned earlier. The digital doesn't necessarily lend itself to the affective. It's binary in nature, but there's also a question of data. Whatever you put into the digital realm somehow has to be passed through the binary, becomes quantitative in nature. So this is something that we've been sort of grappling with, let's say, in this project, and I'm going to share some of that effort with you today. But then, since we were thinking about borders and migration, I suppose the digital has to be addressed because the digital is somehow a constituent part of the production of contemporary borders. If we're thinking about, I don't know, visa decisions, asylum applications, they're passed through the digital. They encompass algorithmic and calculative logics. And biometric data is kind of used as part of these decisions. So these kind of sorting and filtering mechanisms are absolutely essential to the way the border regime works. So work that's sort of dealing with borders, if we ignore the digital, is kind of, is half done, I would say. So there is an imperative to address it. And then I suppose if we're doing a more emancipatory work, then to address the digital through a different ontology is absolutely key. So the two ways in which this project has done some of this work is thinking through the question of location. So thinking about location as it emerges within the journeys of undocumented migration, but then thinking about how do we encode location within the digital, and then thinking also about navigation as a kind of as an extension of that. So the image on the screen is actually the homepage of one of the major outputs of the project, which is a mapping platform. I guess you could call it a mapping platform. It's kind of quite far away from a traditional map. And it's been designed alongside Radical Cartographies, who are a Belgian group of kind of software designers, graphic designers, who sort of describe their practice as making of working with the digital for the public good. I'm going to explain a little bit. So this presentation really explains the thinking behind the platform, and right at the end of the presentation I'll go through it with you and show you a little bit of what we did. But in rethinking location, maps are often locative, of course. We're used to kind of encoding location within maps. They tell us where we are, where we're located, where other things and people are located, but they're usually just, location is understood as a pin, as a point on the map, a set of coordinates essentially. But if we start to think with a more kind of expansive idea of location that might come from, critical thinking, feminism, etc., then, we're in the realm of more situated and embodied understandings. So the question is, how can that be encoded? And then in relation to navigation, navigation for us here was, in one way, sort of thinking with how undocumented migrants are kind of navigating, right, across kind of militarized borders, across incredibly difficult lives, and then how they're navigating the world, but then also how we might navigate the digital platform in the same idiom, I suppose. In that sense, actually, I'm really looking forward to Laura Kurgan's keynote, because I think the question of navigation is going to come up there as well. But for me, really, the question of navigation has transformed through the work that we've been doing on unsettlement. So in the conversations that we've had with people who are caught within the circulation of borders. And it's led me to understand that, the sort of idea of navigation that I was starting with was very limited. If we think of navigation just as a movement from A to B, or navigation within the digital realm as being merely a question of interface, UI, UX, etc. And so instead I've been thinking with the idea of orientation instead. So thinking with somebody like Sarah Ahmed, Hito Steril, crucially also with the people that, of course, we've been speaking with, and I'll expand on this point a little bit later on. The images is from kind of earlier work from this particular project, but I like to show it as it says something about location. It's a Syrian activist who's drawing his journey of escape from Syria following the revolution. So this is kind of around 2016 that this map was drawn. He's a graphic designer, part of an activist collective who tried to sort of expose some of the brutalities of the Assad regime, which is why he had to leave very early on in the revolution. And the reason the map is drawn so well is because he's a graphic designer, and it shows a kind of circulatory movement, right? His circulatory movement between Syria, Lebanon, and Turkey as he tries to find a way to live and to carry on. And here already there's an inkling of movement being much more complex than just a movement from A to B. But the people I've been speaking to more recently as part of this topological atlas project, which I forgot to say is kind of looking at sort of undocumented migration from sort of Pakistan, Iran, Afghanistan towards Europe. So that's the kind of general direction, I suppose. So the people that I've spoken to in this particular project, on the one hand, they quite simply find themselves in places they do not know or are unable to locate themselves on a map. But I think something more complex than that is going on, which is that, apart from the fact of being a little bit lost and not knowing where they are because of the ways people are traveling, in the back of a lorry, for example, or simply not having phones that are working. But I think what's also happening is that these are situations where people seem to have lost their ability to sort of fully situate themselves in a world that's somehow unfolded too fast and too slow at the same time. So there's this kind of disorientation that often people speak about. And I think there's, within this kind of, within the situation, there's a question of temporality as well as that of space. So you manage to kind of partially orientate yourself through temporal and embodied means, but that there's a kind of constant negotiation going on, and that this in turn affects how you see the world. And so this situation, this way of being in the world, was something that we were interested in thinking with and working with and perhaps sort of representing through our mapping practices. So the image on the screen is of a place called Gwadar, which is on the Arabian Sea coast of Pakistan. It's very close to the Iranian border. Excuse me. I'm not really going to talk about this image because I don't have time. I've had to cut the presentation a little bit. But if we speak to people, we spent a lot of time in Gwadar speaking to people who are kind of on their way. And if you speak to people, they would, say something like, okay, we traveled from Gwadar, which is the port city, to Bandar Abbas, which is in Iran, also a port city, and we traveled by boat. But then they go on to say that they describe this journey as traveling through the jungle. Now, I don't know what the jungle kind of evokes in the Lebanese imaginary or in this region, but, in the kind of Euro-American imaginary, there is this kind of exoticized tropical jungle idea, right? But the word itself, jungle, it has two origins. One is from Sanskrit, where it can be jangala, so it can mean a rough and arid land, or it can be jungle from Farsi, which is understood as a tangled thicket. Now, Urdu, the language in which this conversation was taking place, takes from both these languages, so Sanskrit via Hindi, and then also Farsi. And within this kind of language, jungle, in Urdu, jungle can mean all of these things that I just said, but it can also mean an environment that is difficult, that is somehow lonely, perhaps a little bit remote, but a place, crucially, where you can also find a bit of inner peace. And so the word jungle is a kind of repeated motif that appears within the conversations, within the interviews we've had with migrants. And yeah, it's not exactly speaking of peace, I guess, but they're speaking about kind of moments of respite, maybe is a better way of saying it. And in these descriptions, the jungle becomes a kind of shape-shifting entity, as much a description of a landscape as it is an actor to be negotiated with. So alongside, let's say, the bus drivers, the petty officials, all the other agents that facilitate border crossing. So you can perhaps see that within these kinds of conversations, the idea of location is very layered. It's a process of sedimentation, of confluence. It's certainly not a point on a map. Wrong. Oh, there's an image missing. I don't know why, but we'll just stay on this. So next to sort of thinking through location and navigation, another really important aspect that we were thinking through was the question of agency. So the difficulty of representing the experience of others, but to also sort of not really sort of reduce this merely to a reaction to the system in which people are caught, the kind of border regime. And so for us, it was a matter within, let's say, the mapping platform that I'm speaking of right now. It was thinking about agency was really a matter of sort of working with this large archive of material that we'd gathered over 4 or 5 years, 5, 6 years actually, and to somehow discern and represent the experiences and agencies that were embedded within that archive. So just to say, for lots of important reasons that were touched upon in the kind of earlier sort of introductions, work that happens within kind of violent situations like that of migration, and certainly work that happens within migration discourse in relation to mapping and spatial violence tends to kind of focus on exposing that violence and we know the reasons for that. But somehow my research and engagement with this topic has been a little different. It's not that it's kind of trying to elide the violence that people are clearly subject to, but it's more about trying to discern the forms of life that kind of emerge within what are often very deathly situations. So to do what somebody like Catherine McKittrick calls for, which is to move away from, and I quote from her, violence as the sole spatial analytic. So to really think that despite all the violence and the death, what is it that people manage to do? What are the kinds of lives they manage to live and create despite everything? So I've been using this phrase, forms of life, and I'm citing here the work of Sylvia Wynter, who's sort of written extensively on the relationship between representation and the category or the definitions of what we refer to as the human. And Wynter writes about how representational practices birth forms of life, so that's her phrase, and forms of life that are specific to each culture. And that then in turn produce categories of the human. So the European Enlightenment man being, of course, the most kind of dominant category, but not the only one. I think this is an insight, this idea that, representation and cultural specific representations produce forms of human, produce forms of the human. It's an insight that often gets kind of forgotten in work that's within the sphere of the humanitarian, where we kind of invoke the human as a kind of general and all-encompassing category. And so in thinking about migration and borders, the border regime, so it produces categories of the human, whether it's, the criminal migrant or the abject victim, etc. But at the same time, the people who are on the move, they're also creating kind of their own practices, their own ways of being and living, and how to account for these is, of course, a question of representation. But migration discourse, they're the wrong way around, damn it. Okay, anyway. But migration discourse has a huge problem with representation, especially when the focus is on the journey itself. So we've all seen the maps, I assume, in the popular press. They're certainly there in UK, Europe, North America, etc. These kind of maps of migration with kind of large arrows all pointing towards Europe or North America that are sort of talking about the large-scale movement of people. And these maps, whilst they kind of speak about this movement, they ignore a lot of other things. For example, the large-scale movement of people, for example, within the African continent or within regions in Asia. So like all other maps, these are kind of edited documents that do political work. And so this image that you see on the screen is a poster that we did for an exhibition of the Topological Atlas, which is also a representation of journeys, but kind of done in a sort of slightly different idiom. And it's based on all the conversations we've had with people about their journeys. And all it does is it lists places that are mentioned in these conversations in the order of their appearance, just one after the other. And each column is a kind of conversation. And as the title says, it's a journey in itself. And there's something about this kind of representation that kind of questions the directionality of movement that's embedded within those migration maps I was speaking of earlier. But at the same time, I guess it sort of questions an idea of scale in the sense that, tiny villages have the same, let's say, importance in this representation as, a big city. But if you start to look carefully, which you might not be able to because it's not that high resolution, but if you start to look carefully at this kind of at these lists, essentially, what you see is that certain place names begin to repeat within the same conversation. And you might ask yourself, well, why is this happening? Is it because people are being sent back and forth across borders? Are they, caught in this circulation? Or is it that there is something about the way that people are recalling their journeys? Because we know that a linear temporal logic is not always how things work, right? Especially when we're talking about incredibly traumatic experiences. And so what's important about this is that in places like the UK, Europe, US, this cornerstone of the asylum application, the asylum interview, relies on you being able to recall what's happened to you, but to be able to recall your journey in an ordered fashion, right? Because if you get the order wrong, that's considered to be not true, right? And so if the order is wrong, it's used as a reason to deny you asylum. So something, to kind of think with how memory works, which we know is non-linear, it's kind of a tactic that they use, I suppose. So to consider forms of life that emerge within what are highly unequal and devastating situations, such as the journeys portrayed here, requires a different way of looking. But it also, I think, requires a discourse beyond that of mere agency. So this map does not show, I don't think, a straightforward idea of agency. It is kind of much more contingent somehow, what this map is showing. So Abdul Malik Semaan writes, I think, of this kind of agency in his new book, The Surrounds, where, of course, this is written in relation to kind of precarious lives in the in urban areas of the South. But there's a kind of there's kind of an emphasis on things like negotiating, making deals, positioning yourself in various ways, brokering in order to get by. So there's always this kind of feeling that you're hedging your bets, right? And some of this way of being, I think, can be seen in the journeys that we've been looking at within this project, but only if we move away from what I like to call the shores of Europe. So away, let's say, from, southern Italy, away from the Greek islands, which are really the core of where migration discourse within Europe, within UK, has really been located. And so because of the way academia works, has really shaped migration studies as well. And so if you move away from those places, I think you get to somewhere else. So some of the work that for me has been really to insist on where we start from matters, which is of course a kind of southern urbanism question as well. So we could start here. This is a bus station on the outskirts of the Pakistani megacity of Karachi, and it's a place where many people start their journeys towards Europe. And it's a place where the smuggling of goods overlaps with the clandestine movement of people. And it's a place where, a community kind of coalesces around the border, and it supports an economy and a way of life. So the border understood in all of its complexity, away, of course, from the geopolitical border. So to pay attention to these communities that coalesce around the border, understood in this complexity, doesn't produce perfect victims or narratives of perfect victims for humanitarian redress. But what it does show instead is the varying forms of precarious labor that service everyday aspects of contemporary borders. So from the petty official who might check IDs at random, to the smuggler who can help you pass through a checkpoint somewhere near the Pakistan-Iran border, or the young boy you see at the front of the picture who might make you chai along the way. These are all incredibly important actors in the functioning of borders and the displacements they enact. So the racial production of contemporary borders is somehow designed to keep people moving, not necessarily to keep them out. Although clearly this is also, a very brutal part of the same system. So somebody like the kind of seminal book on border studies, Border as Method by Mazadra and Nielsen, speaks of this kind of circulation that borders produce. So a system of circulation where deportation regimes, precarious lives, and militarized borders all come together to create this kind of global underclass. This sort of both wanted and unwanted within what I like to call this kind of fortified spaces of northern privilege. So somebody like Harsha Valia has spoken about this as well, if anybody's into kind of migration kind of related discourse. But Harsha Valia speaks about it in terms of temporary migration, so the legalization of, labor to be moved across the world in order to do the kind of jobs that some people won't do. But I guess my work is kind of looking at the more irregular side of it, the kind of illegalized side of that kind of movement. So in trying to come to grips with the system of circulation and how it affects the people caught within it, I've been working with this notion of the persistent present. So because in many ways, time is much more important than space when we're thinking about these movements. How time becomes embodied within a particular life, how it's deployed as a mechanism of control within deportation regimes. So, people might wait years for an asylum decision, but once that decision is made, they're told to leave within hours. But I think it also kind of seems that temporality is crucial for sort of discerning the possibilities of living otherwise within these kind of incredibly kind of strong mechanisms of control. So there's something about the temporality that kind of operates within that bus station in Karachi, as an example, that really allows for other possibilities to emerge, brokerage and deal making, etc. So this particular image is of an Afghan woman I spoke with in Odessa, again around 2016, 2017, who had arrived with her family with the help of an agent. And it was only after they arrived there and spoke to a lawyer that they realized that they weren't in Europe, which is what they'd paid to get to, where they'd paid to get to, but were actually stuck at its edge in Ukraine. And her account speaks of a very difficult journey, very long, but also about the heaviness she felt in waiting for their lives to restart. And she so I'd asked her to draw a map, and she starts by drawing this kind of small circle in the middle of the page, which denotes the place that she's tried to leave several times, her home in Afghanistan. She and her family were escaping the Taliban. And so while speaking, she draws these kind of lines that come out from the circle and then go back in again. She's drawing it again and again. And each line denotes a curtailed journey. And at one point, she stops and writes that number in the corner of the page, which is the amount in US dollars that they had paid for a passage to Europe. And so the video, I'm not showing the video here, but it is a kind of video, and the video shows her kind of underscoring the number with a kind of hand gesture. And there's something, I don't know, about the way she does that, sort of gives a glimpse of the person she is, alongside these kind of arms clad in this thin cotton lawn material, which those of us from the region will recognize. It's kind of, to me, the pattern on it is like a Pakistani pattern. So something about the way she's sort of, even from the arms and the kind of gestures, you can see who she is, because for reasons of safety and ethics, we weren't allowed to show her face. So going back to the idea of agency and of resistance, these are situations where people are caught within faceless systems and bureaucracies, or are caught in the very real violence of borders. But this is hardly ever understood in an oppositional logic, as I said earlier. Instead, the very regime that is keeping you out, might one day let you in. So the logic of the border becomes one of transgression and of subversion, and of finding a way through, and in the process creating forms of life and living within borders. So now I want to stop and show you a short film. It's only 10 minutes long, but really the film kind of speaks about some of these ideas of circulation and unsettlement that borders produce, the different temporalities of the border, kind of colonial time next to the temporality of brokerage. And the film you can think of as a kind of as a sort of template for the kind of mapping platform that we were making. So the kinds of ways in which it shows migration was something that we wanted to do with the mapping platform, which I will show later. Give me a second.
उन पहाड़ों के पीछे क्या है? शायद एक सब्ज बाग है. What does it mean to spend your life attempting to be somewhere or someplace else? Should lives caught in movement only ever be understood as being pushed or pulled? What if the thing that pushes you away also pulls you in? What if you know what is to befall you, but you go anyway? We know that borders are technologies of power. We also know that they are designed to keep people moving, circulating, fleeing. Unsettlement as strategy of power. If borders are designed to unsettle, they are equally designed to identify and to locate. To live in borders is to be unsettled, to be elsewhere but not anywhere. To live in borders is to be always contingent on this or that, on anything at all. To live in borders is to be yourself and to be someone else. A subspar is a mirage, a promise that is also a delusion. एक आस होती है कुछ उम्मीद होती है. A musafir kash can foretell the coming of a dust storm. They can show you a flickering light to follow. They will hide you, but they can also trap you. What risks are you willing to take? How much time do you have to give? How much money do you have? A dunker will weigh up your chances and your resources. They will know what price there is to be paid. All journeys must require a map, a way to navigate across unknown lands and hostile grounds. Those seafarers of old conquered our lands with just the horizon and the stars as guides. Our phones pinging to the satellites overhead locate us as much as they reveal us. But how do you navigate without a datum? When the stars have misaligned and there is no horizon to act as guide, how do you find your way? How do you navigate through a mirage? You have to anchor yourself in the shifting sands of a subspar, if only for a little while. Everyone needs some respite. They were supposed to be on ziyarat. Is there a difference between one kind of visit and another? Who gets to have a visit visa? And who must dream of a subspar? The undocumented can become documented, able to sail the seas on cargo ships that traverse fluidly across our world. But the ground is another matter altogether. The ground, it turns out, is contingent. You might come aground, but you cannot stand on the ground. Those whose labor transports goods across the shifting seas must stay there. There where jurisdictions overlap and waters are international, between nations, where no claim can be made and no rights are to be had. While borders at sea are elusive, in contested lands they proliferate and congeal. In geographies further from the edges of Europe, the smooth flow of logistics inevitably meets the latent desires of a people to decide their own fate and that of their lands. To graze livestock, to attend the grave of a loved one, to simply walk across what were once open lands. To visit becomes unthinkable. Why does one type of oil flow so smoothly, while another becomes viscous, its flow heavy, stuck, congealed? Perhaps it depends on what it lubricates.
Mazdurani wasta tahari utahari parvam tahari mazdur sajar bekamana chini mabshari mazdur mayari mazdurani wasta tahari utahari parvam tahari.
To live according to another's time. Factory time can become a somatic fact when the seasonal rhythms of village life are disrupted and the lunar calendar is half replaced by another measure altogether. So how do you locate yourself in between measures, in between the Ravi and the Chenab when no water flows? Ravi's waters are close to us. There is no water there. We have been given water through MR Link. From Sialkot, Marla headwater is picked up and released into the canals, into MR Link and BRB. There are sub-branches. The rhythms of village life are also imposed, ruled by colonial canals and property lines, by cast iron water treaties and capricious snow melts. But who has the privilege to be bored, to long for another rhythm, to ask what lies beyond?
Jade, hard, sawan, Badron, Asu, Kate, Magar, Po, Mang, Po, Asu, Kate, Magar, Po, Mang.
Pagan?
Pagan. Again, Chetar. Chetar. Again, Vasakh.
बड़े मरीजा निवासता तहारी युतहारी वर्मा में तहारी मजदूर सारा जाल बेगमाना नीमा बिशारी उनका मजदूर मयारी
So yeah, some of the topics the film covers, obviously speaking about the kind of violence of borders, the border regime, the system of militarized borders and what it does, right? The agents, the smugglers. But what it's really kind of focusing on is somehow how being caught within the kind of circulation of borders creates a kind of illusion or a kind of strange idea where you're kind of constantly thinking about what lies beyond. So this idea that the border regime produces these kind of dreams and delusions that people get caught in. And so within these difficult journeys, as I said, people get disoriented. So this kind of persistent present that I was speaking of. So one example is that many people don't call home, right? So they might be on the journey, they're kind of maybe settled, they're kind of doing okay, maybe they're in Istanbul, they're all right, they're not too bad, but somehow they won't call home even though the families are waiting, and there's this kind of desire to constantly keep going, right? So there's something about the way it affects your own mental kind of state. But then there's of course questions of labor within the film, so the kind of footage from the workshop was from a kind of factory on the outskirts of Istanbul, where migrants are providing cheap labor, and then it kind of loops back into the kind of traditional village life that many people, at least from Pakistan, are kind of leaving from the Punjab province, and it kind of speaks about the different temporalities, the kind of in Pakistan's case, like the legacy of colonial rule, where water is governed by a kind of colonial canal system that produces a certain temporality, right? Water comes sometimes, it doesn't at other times, and then how that fits with other kinds of temporalities. So this is, I like to show this because this is a map of all the people who were kind of working on our project, and it also shows that kind of route that we were looking at. So the dotted line is the route of undocumented migration that we've been looking at. The dots are places where we've either been working or some of us live. And then the loops are, of course, our own privileged movement across the globe. And it's important to say that every conversation, every interview was marked by this discrepancy of the people who could move across borders and those who couldn't. And this was also present within the research team, where for example, researchers in Pakistan were not able to get visas, etc. And so it's kind of a project about migration, but it's got the border is embedded within it. And at the same time, what was I going to say about this? It's a project about migration that's also migrated. So to do kind of ethical and equitable work within kind of especially European and UK institutions, where you've got people situated in different places, is really difficult. And so part of the reason the project moved so much was because of institutional policy. So I'm not going to go into this, but just to say that the border is in the university as well, in Europe and in UK. And then finally, the last thing to say about this is that partway through the project, COVID hit. So since we had this team from all over the place, our idea was that once we've done all the work, the field work, etc., we'd all come together in Turkey, which was a place where most people could more or less get to. And we'd have these big workshops and talk about what we were doing, etc. And then, COVID hit and none of us could travel. And so that particular situation also changed the way we thought about the mapping platform, which was originally just thought of as, okay, we're just going to make a mapping platform that's talking about that's trying to represent these journeys, but in the end it became a kind of platform that should allow us to work together across different geographies, in our own kind of world. So it became a place where we shared our analysis, essentially. So this image on the left is not the platform, it's just one of the images that we started with right at the beginning to try to think about, well, how are we going to make this, or what are we thinking about? We had 5 years worth of material, which was kind of both an archive and a repository that somehow needed to be worked on by a research team that was scattered across various geographies. And this image, we call it the patchy globe in honor of Anna Singh's patchy Anthropocene. And really the idea was that, we want to produce a representation that is not flattened, that has that kind of patchiness of experience that we were all facing in our various kind of socially situated situations. So no unitary view, instead a kind of composite of relations and entanglements and situated points of view was what we were trying to think with. And then the kind of screenshots are just essentially the database, which was a series of images, videos, and various texts that we were working with. And so we started really with this. We call it a codex, but essentially just a glossary of terms that came out of all the conversations that we'd had with people on the move, but also with border officials, also with border communities. So it's a kind of, in some ways, the way social science works, through kind of making terms of analysis. So, you have something like hyperreality, which is, in the bottom corner, which really speaks of the way people describe their journeys as almost fantastical or, uncanny situations that seem fictitious or reminiscent, as often when people are describing extremely violent situations. So it's clearly also a kind of way of sort of protecting yourself from the trauma. We had words that kept coming again and again. Dates were mentioned a lot, goats were mentioned a lot, but then, things that you would expect like camps, checkpoints, arrests, etc. So this glossary was really the basis of the mapping, which we used as a way to kind of create relations across the database. And so this glossary was evolving as we were creating the relationship. So it was a kind of back and forth movement. So we would kind of use the terms to kind of tag the text and the images as a way of, as I said, just making a kind of map of the work. And each of us was doing that wherever we were sitting. So the platform really became a kind of tool to track threads of meaning through digital artifacts. And it started with the codex, which was this evolving vocabulary, and we used it to annotate segments of text and images. And so it was also then became a kind of negotiation between, our own kind of culturally and socially situated understandings of the terms in the glossary that kept evolving. So this, I don't know if I'm just showing it because this is one of the many diagrams that Atelier Cartography made for us to make us understand what they were going on about in the database. The database is a flat structure, but there's a whole kind of set of relations that are made. And so we were in this realm for like years trying to work out what the hell to do, but eventually it worked. And so through this kind of, this is kind of an early iteration of the work. So of course not kind of made beautiful as yet. But sort of as we were working through the kind of database, through the archive, and making these relations, it was producing these maps, which were essentially navigations or movement through the database and producing stories and narratives. And then the thing on the right is essentially the back end that no one can see apart from the researchers who are on the team. And so we just we're sort of assembling fragments of images, fragments of text, and then you can comment on it. So it's a way of kind of narrating experience through the database, I guess is the best way of putting it. And then the thing spits out images like this, kind of collaged images, layered images. It's a kind of experimentation with a kind of form of mechanical navigation through a kind of possible landscape in which we were kind of tracing parts and commenting along the way. And so when you're in the kind of on the platform yourself as a kind of public person from the general public, let's say, you can make these kinds of images, but at some point you will kind of encounter these kind of curated parts through the archive that we've made as researchers, and you can encounter them along the way, read them, interact with them, and move on. And so this one's talking about this idea of oasis and how a particular mosque became a really important space within these kinds of journeys in Turkey, because it was kind of, and the way it's described is kind of very particular about, a pear tree and water, etc. So this kind of moment, how narration becomes really important in these stories as well. And then the digital sometimes takes physical form. So this is an exhibition of the kind of platform or of the work that we were doing. And the question that we were thinking with here was, what does an unsettled archive look like and how should it operate? And so for us, it was definitely involved a kind of critical distancing from, I suppose, the regimes of regimes of visuality that are embedded within more standard sort of mapping platforms that sort of claim to make faraway places visible and therefore to make them knowable. So instead we were sort of emphasizing experience, the intensification of narratives, to kind of glimpse other possible worlds, but at the same time to sort of certain things remain illegible and opaque. So there are several levels to the mapping platform that you can enter depending on who and where you're situated and what your level of access is. And that was kind of important to us. So then to come back finally as an ending to this kind of question of navigation and orientation that I started with, I want to sort of speak about this kind of very important text. It's a really small text that Hito Sterol wrote ages ago in eFlux, but somehow is really important for us as we were thinking about this work. And it's a text that kind of unpicks Turner's painting, The Slave Ship. And the oil painting shows a scene from the moment when the slaves are thrown overboard upon the captain's realization, and Sterol's sort of writing this, upon the captain's realization that they were only insured as cargo lost at sea and not as people who might fall ill and die. And so Sterol sort of says that in this painting, the horizon has not yet disappeared, but it has become less stable through being duplicated and scattered. And she writes, I'm going to quote from her, "At the site of the effects of colonialism and slavery, linear perspective, the central viewpoint, the position of mastery, control, and subjecthood is abandoned and starts tumbling and tilting, taking with it the idea of space and time as systematic constructs." So this description of the loss of horizon in many ways, I think, corresponds to the persistent present described by undocumented migrants, where normative ideas of linear time and space become untenable. So just as the sextant and the Mercator projection were key instruments in the navigation of a world understood through the colonial logics of the horizon, we need an understanding of the instruments and maps being used to navigate and to continue the colonizing logic within a horizonless world. And I suppose, I guess what I'm suggesting here is that the kind of fragmented horizon that Sterol is pointing towards in that oil painting kind of finds its endpoint within the digital realm, where there is this complete loss of horizon. And so, some of the tools that we use in the digital sphere, I guess I should unmute. So this was really the reason for kind of questioning some of the standard mapping tools. So the digital platform that we've produced really tries to unlearn some of the standard modes in which we might navigate the digital, because the platform obfuscates. You have to spend a lot of time on it for it to make any sense to you. If you give up early, it makes no sense. But also alongside that, it's also about unlearning the temporalities of the border regime and the spatialities embedded within computational navigation. So while navigation requires an external datum, the horizon, orientation is related to the sharing of time and space. So here I'm thinking with Sarah Ahmed's notion of orientation. She's writing about queer lives, but her insight into how orientations can act both as straightening devices and as and provide fleeting moments where something slips and other inhabitations are possible is, I think, applicable also to the lives that I'm discussing. This kind of slippage, a moment of orientation with potentiality in a life full of disorientation is kind of the small possibility that's left in finding new directions within what are kind of totalizing horizonless worlds. So orientation then becomes a kind of practice and methodology of working with the chronopolitics of migration, and it's emerged through the experiences of undocumented migrants from their stories. Their inhabitation of a persistent present can also be considered a kind of refusal of the normative concepts of linear and embodied time in notions of progress and modernity and in the digital. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nishat, for this insightful, very generous presentation. I will start with a few questions or reactions, and then we can open it up to the public. I'd like first to talk about one of the last things that you presented, which is this, what you called the codex, or the vocabulary that you used in the topological atlas. And it makes me think of the kind of the importance of creating a taxonomy before even getting to map, to define a new vocabulary that is maybe more relational in your case, or is able to facilitate the co-authoring of the map. And I was wondering if you could talk a bit about this.
Yeah, so in a funny way, like we started off, we did a lot of interviews, so how to deal with them was a question, and I'm not a proper social scientist, but there is a social science kind of software called NVivo that you can use to do some of this work, but it produces a certain type of analysis. And so for us, it was really important to start with kind of the visual and with a taxonomy that also, or the glossary that also relates to the visual in some way. And so we tried actually with this NVivo software, and it's a proprietary software, etc., to try to do this. And it somehow just wasn't working for lots of reasons. But also actually, just not everybody could understand how this damn thing worked. I couldn't make it work. And so there's something about how these platforms produce certain ways of seeing the world that are already embedded within the way that they're encoded, within the way they operate, what they allow you to do and what they don't. So that was kind of part of why we started it. But yeah, starting with the glossary was also kind of a way again of, eliding the kind of very visual, of putting the visual in the back for a bit and thinking with words, with kind of stories, with narrative, but also with definitions of kind of, taking the responsibility to try to define what we had seen.
And this also, it makes me wonder also what is the kind of imagined audience of this atlas, and where you might imagine them situated temporally and even geographically. Mm-hmm. I wonder, do these platforms kind of help other people experiencing similar journeys navigate their own, or is it more geared towards research, or what kind of function do you see them having?
This particular platform, I think, is not necessarily geared towards the people on the move. I mean, for them, we did other things. But I think this is for researchers, and it's for others who are thinking with how to work with this kind of data. It is, by the way, it is encoded with several different languages, so it has kind of Turkish and Urdu and stuff embedded within it. We didn't get to translate everything, but it has that kind of capability. So the idea was to turn it into a kind of a piece of software that people can put on their computer and then use themselves. But it's sort of held with sticky tape and glue at the moment, so it doesn't quite do that yet, and we need funding to do that properly. But yeah, I think it's a tool for researchers, actually, especially ones that think through the visual, who maybe, I think in architecture especially, a lot of people are working with, in between ethnographic and spatial and, the usual tools of the architect, but ethnography is becoming much more important, and yet the way it's done within the social sciences doesn't always resonate with us. So this is a kind of more intuitive way of kind of making connections.
You also mentioned a kind of mix between ethnographic work and more methodological mapping work at the beginning of your presentation. And I was wondering if you kind of integrate the two, if some of your respondents, you showed some stills of people drawing their own maps. So I was wondering if this is a kind of systematic method that you use, or is there also an interpretive dimension to your work where you also reinterpret these stories to be able to make these maps as researchers?
Yeah, so the kind of maps that I showed earlier on, this is earlier work, and I've stopped doing that. I don't know why. I guess because I felt like in the end there were kind of moments in time of kind of people's lives, but they didn't go beyond that. So a lot of the kind of mapping work of a similar ilk that we've done within this project, which I didn't show, was working with communities. So we worked in Gawada, the place that I mentioned on the Arabian Sea coast, where we worked with the fisherfolk community a lot. And there, a deep sea port has been built by China, and it's kind of got huge kind of investment by China, massive airport, etc. And it's completely disrupting the lives of the Mahigir, the fisherfolk. So a lot of the mappings we did there were about trying to understand their lives and the kind of livelihoods and the ways of being in the world that were being destroyed by this kind of massive development effort. So mapping where the fish is, where the stars are, but also the different names of the winds, etc. And that was an effort for them, actually, because they wanted some of that to be made visible.
This also links to the question, I think, of extraction. I think that came up in your work. In your presentation, it also comes up in your work, and it makes me think of the connection between mapping and biopolitics or necropolitics, especially when we think of migration and in the context of Lebanon. The situation of migrant workers and the legal frameworks that kind of determine this experience to a large degree. I don't know if you're familiar at all with the context here of migration or not, but maybe you can talk about it in relation to your own sites of work. This notion of maybe slow violence, of how also bodies are regulated, let in, but also pushed out, let in, to be able to do these kinds of very limited kind of work that others won't do. So I don't know if you can speak a bit about this.
Yeah, there's one aspect of the project that I, again, didn't speak about, but we did a lot of work on the kind of legal context in Pakistan, especially, of kind of people who are deported or returned, etc. And when you look at the kind of the legal sort of, the immigration ordinance, etc. It's an ordinance, so it's a military law. And you look at how it's kind of based on colonial law as well. You sort of realize that right from the beginning, the kind of the body of the Indian subject, let's say, has been one of labor, right? Has been regulated through labor. So Pakistan was one of the first countries in the world to illegalize emigration. So normally, you get caught at borders for illegally entering another country, but it's illegal to leave the country. And this is a class-based thing, because someone with my kind of privilege can come and go as they please. But if you're from a certain class in Pakistan, especially if you're from certain ethnic kind of backgrounds, then to leave you have to get a permit, because it's already assumed that you're leaving because you're going to be labor, right? You're going to be a body that is understood as labor. So, yeah, there's a kind of, yeah. So a lot of the project is thinking about how labor is, of course, absolutely at the base of everything that happens in terms of migration.
I think on this point, but also many others that you mentioned, there's a lot of parallels that we can draw with Palestine. And I think especially of kind of chronopolitics and the weaponization of speed and time. And I think that, yeah, this notion that some people's time is kind of valued differently than others, and some processes deliberately slow down and kind of interrupt journeys. And it also links to something that you mentioned about this kind of smooth flow of logistics. And I think that it's an interesting tension between these two, where somehow safe passage has been monetized. So as long as you have the means, you may be able to pass. But also it makes me think of, for example, the Ever Given that was stuck in the Suez Canal, and how these questions link also to ideas of like stuckedness or immobility in different ways.
So in many ways, another reason why the platform obfuscates is because it's wasting your time. So, you know, I'm joking, but it is about kind of playing with this idea of time. But also this notion that, you know, some people aren't allowed to be bored. Yeah, you're not allowed to be bored and leave, right? That's the fundamental point. When you speak to anybody in Pakistan who leaves, they use the word farig. Farig means, I've got nothing to do. I'm kind of like just sitting here. It means other things too, but and so to not have the privilege to be bored, to not kind of think about where you might go next, I think is part of this kind of, you know, it is part of, it is a temporality, right? It's a temporality that you're sort of supposed to be stuck in, that you can just stay here and be bored. But in terms of logistics, again, if I think with Gwadar, the Chinese built the port, but then nothing came. Like one ship once a week would sometimes come. And so, you know, even like that kind of smooth flow of logistics somehow in these places gets stuck. There's these massive roads that have been built. It's a little bit different now. So I'm talking like more sort of 6-7 years ago. But you had these roads and they would just like go nowhere. And then these palm trees that had been planted, but you don't really get palm trees in Gwadar, and they're all like flopping like this because they just can't survive. And so there's this kind of weird sort of, temporality, or this weird idea that comes with logistics, with infrastructure that gets destroyed by the desert winds, which is kind of quite nice.
Maybe one last question. It's a bit general, but I couldn't help but think about it when you mentioned about the way the back end of your platform is designed or upkept. And I was wondering about hosting, actually, and about where this data is stored at an infrastructural level, because it makes me think of something that I recently discovered firsthand, which is that, for example, GPS is a dual-use technology. And we've seen it in application here in Lebanon over the past year, where things like Google Maps were scrambled, civilian flights were unable to land for a long time until they were able to switch their gears into more manual kinds of modes of operation. And I think about GPS in relation to mapping, and also more generally this question of information infrastructure globally and its governance, and how this ties into counter practices of mapping. Are we kind of already always co-opted when we go digital, or is there a way to maybe, I don't know, locally host or host independently, or I don't know if you have any insight into this aspect of the work?
Yeah, so Radical Cartographies, who really made the platform, we made it in collaboration. So it's hosted on their servers in Brussels, in their office. I think it's in their office anyway. So it's very much, they're very kind of careful about these things. So we knew, of course, we didn't want it on the cloud, et cetera, et cetera. But of course, it comes with, a question of, well, who looks after the data? Who does this kind of system administration, which is kind of a lot. So right now, they're looking after it all. So I think, these things have an obsolescence date. So eventually, in a few years, it probably will just kind of go into oblivion. I don't know. But yeah, certainly we wouldn't host it anywhere other than on our own servers. But I was thinking about what you were saying about GPS and things, like in Pakistan, when the kind of drone bombings were happening post sort of September 11, since then up till now, geofencing is like a really kind of standardized practice. And so, yeah, this idea of GPS. So this is why I was sort of questioning the idea of location, because absolutely none of this needs to come anywhere near people on the move.
Yeah. Thank you very much. We can open the floor to questions.
Hi, thanks. We saw a bit of this, thank you, Nishat, but I'm wondering, is there anything in the atlas that permits us to think about how those on the move, let's call them migrants, I feel sometimes you're perhaps resistant to use this term, maybe, you kind of, there's a reason maybe why the migrant is not an adequate signifier. But I wonder whether there's room to think about the ways in which they themselves, I guess it's a biopolitical question to an extent, but it's also an infrastructural question that echoes with what Monica's been saying. I'm trying to just think as I speak, but it seems that there's, of course, an emphasis on ethnography and on, testimony and the kind of lived experience of those in movement, of those unsettled, and I'm curious whether there's something in the platform or in the atlas or in the project as a whole that can permit us to see how they're made into those subjects. So whether it is the arduousness of the trip, whether there is the ways in which the objective conditions of bordering appear, right, and that could be, the agents or the kind of legal, the black market of the legality, the kind of legal black market, as it were, that allows for the kind of the agents to kind of, move these unsettled around, or whether, the entire infrastructure, the bordering infrastructure, is it present? Do we, is there a way that the atlas, because I think that, otherwise I guess, we're looking at the unsettled, isolated. Are we? Maybe it's a question, but are we looking at at the unsettled in an isolated manner, or how does the landscape, the legal infrastructure, the kind of the state infrastructure feature within the ways that they are not just bodies, they're perhaps laboring bodies. Clearly, they're laborers. They're not just looking to move because they're bored, or maybe they are, I don't know. But it seems that, there are dire political, economic conditions, social conditions that produce certain forms of unsettlement, and that produce the difficulty and the danger of that unsettlement. So I was just wondering how those objective conditions also feature within the project. Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, so
that was convoluted, sorry.
So I focused in this presentation mostly on the interviews with migrants, but of course we did also speak with the smugglers themselves, the agents. So we have a lot of interviews with the agents that are part of the platform, so that they're part of the encoding. We also spoke to a lot of officials, so right from kind of the level of the officials sat in the kind of capital of particular provinces, right down to the person who's actually at the border. And you can see within their kind of the way they narrate what's happening, how different their perspective is, right? So the person sat in the FIA authority, the Federal Investigative Authority in Pakistan, in Lahore, the kind of capital of the most kind of powerful province, how they describe the Pakistan-Iran border in relation to, what the kind of the border official who's from that particular region describes it. So all of that is there. There's another film that kind of focuses more on their sort of experience and speaks about, this how the border forms actually. But yeah, I didn't show it this time. But it's all there within the platform and the kind of images from the border, the kind of the fencing. So at the time that we were doing that work, the Pakistan-Iran border was being fenced, and kind of a trench was being dug, but there was a lot of kind of questions of how far it had gone. People didn't really know because those areas are fairly remote. And so we did a lot of that mapping. We don't show it for obvious reasons, but it's all there, kind of hidden underneath in the layers of the platform.
I feel like I might have skipped the queue there. Okay, yeah, no, I was very interested by the platform that it kind of seems like it's a means of expressing complexity, and I guess I've always engaged with kind of web platforms and narration as a way of kind of simplifying, clarifying, kind of, you know, spoon feeding information to people. So I was wondering if you know, how kind of how would you say, like, how you engaged with that kind of I don't know, this dichotomy, and whether you explored other kinds of ways of engaging a public through the web, through the platform.
Yeah, what we didn't want to show was just kind of stories of people, you know, on the move. There's plenty of work, amazing work that's done that. But at the same time, I think that the kind of question that underlies all of this for me is, you know, if it was a question of telling a story that would change someone's mind, then people's minds would have changed already. We know this from Gaza as well. And so so that was not the reason for doing this work. And it was more kind of to engage somebody within this, whilst they don't know what's going on somehow. That was something. So the project is always kind of trying to sit between these ideas of evidence and affect, because also the stories that people are telling us don't always line up. So whether it's the kind of border official in Lahore versus the border official in Mand, right at the border, the things they say, whether it's about the building of the fence or the way it's securitized or the way it's kind of governed, is completely different. That's not to say that there isn't a way that things are happening, but these stories and rumors and ways of thinking then change the experience of the people who are crossing the border. So that's what we were trying to map the experience rather than the border itself. That's something to say. And then I was going to make another point, but and then the stories that people tell in that kind of lists image that I was saying, that, you know, people cannot give you an account that is true in that sense. And so it was questioning of that kind of unitary truth. So in that sense, I didn't want to make anything simple. If people want a simple narration, they can just read the interviews, right?
Hello, I guess my question is a bit of a follow-up on Ahmed's question, and maybe you reflected a bit on that, but I just wanted to point out that my question really stems from the experience of listening to your talk, which was extremely compelling, and I found myself very interested in the way you narrate the project, and also the images were extremely compelling. So I was wondering, I guess a very basic question just pops to mind, like, why a map? So I understand the exercise, maybe reflective or reflexive exercise even, and disruption to the traditional way we understand mapping and why we should do that in itself. But I was also kind of following up on Monica's question on the audience and who is the person who is going to engage with this platform. And the question arises on legibility. So what kind of understanding am I getting from that map that I would not necessarily be able to derive from rather than listening to your very compelling speech or watching those images. So just like kind of the added value of the map, and this is kind of a provocation rather than a critique in any way. I would really like to pick your thoughts on that. Thank you.
Yeah, good question. I think what the platform tries to do is to... What's it trying to do? It's not trying to show... It's trying to ask you to make the narrative yourself. So even the film asks, right? what risks are you willing to take? So there's something about putting you in that position of dealing with the archive, or moving through it in order to come up with the narrative. And I think, for me, that's the only thing left when we've shown people what's happening, in kind of the most heart-rending, kind of cheesy way, but also in the kind of most evidentiary sort of number type way. None of it really works in terms of kind of changing people's minds about anything. And so there's something, for me, it was really important to implicate people in what was going on. And I don't know if it really works, but that was the idea, that as you move through it and you're kind of trying to make sense. I mean, some people will give up and they just won't bother, but those who do might then kind of have a different relationship to the material, because you do have to kind of engage to understand it, or to yeah.
I think I can safely say this is the last one. We're a little bit late. Oh, right. No, please. Okay, I'll make it quick. So, just to pick up on this conversation about the I guess, utility of the platform, the way it should engage, the way it attempts to engage in its audience, what it actually ends up doing. So, just to share a little bit, that the students of City Debates and myself, we got lost in it. It's as as a lot of the questions here are indicating, but we did see it as at least on the surface as some kind of really good metaphor, navigable metaphor, if that's a thing, to this idea of like migration processes are not about denying you movement, but it's actually about provoking it in some way, and the way of navigating that platform sort of recreates sort of getting lost through stories and places and times. And my question is about the people behind these stories, and I don't necessarily mean the subjects, but or the interlocutors, or I don't know what's your preferred term for that, but rather the researchers. So maybe I missed it, maybe we missed it, but it's not necessarily always very present in terms of who is the recorder of the record that you see within the platform, unless it is, but it's not necessarily in your face. But you did show today something that I found very interesting, which is, here's a map of the researchers, right? And not to spoil, but tomorrow, I mean, the data feminism work of Catherine D'Ignazio and Lauren Klein talks a lot about exposing the labor behind the map, right? Which you did today, albeit in a sort of a separate sort of credits page, with a complementary map type of visual. I'm wondering how much you think about that and the mapping output itself, and whether this exposure of the labor behind it is part of what you format and give form to.
So actually in the exhibitions this comes out, and you're right, it's maybe not as obvious on the platform, but in the exhibitions we printed out a lot of the narratives that different people had made, and they were all kind of labeled and named, and so you can sort of see the sort of the positionality of the person that's made a particular narrative. So they're all there, and they're just printed out as kind of banners. But it's true that on the platform, it's kind of there in the back end, but not there in the front end. You are right, actually. Need to sort that.
Yeah, just a very short question. I mean, I think that, yes, there was a lot of bleakness, but what also stood out for me in this was that despite the fact that a lot of this is monetized, you have to pay a lot of money to move around, there were also interstices within which people are negotiating. There was one small testimony about a person in a mosque where they found pairs and a safe space. So this is also kind of a map of safe spaces, refuges, the bus station or the terminal. Very funny that this guy was moving around over there. The terminal is a safe space. And here there's also a lot of exchanges which are also map making, which are telling you what are the places of risk and what are the places of refuge that come from conversations that people have with one another. Yeah. And so that's also something that has been designed into the.
Yeah, so, okay, how to say it quickly. So actually, the glossary shows all the terms as equal, but they're not. Some terms are kind of on a higher level than others. So there's a bit of analysis already in it. So hyperreality, oasis, jungle, and some of these terms that are kind of saying something about, so oasis is that kind of moment of respite and safe space. Hyperreality is the risk space. Jungle is about kind of how it affects you being in that place. So those are kind of there as levels of analysis. And you get to that page that you were saying, and suddenly oh, okay, this is important as a way of trying to understand, but it comes up after a while. So, yeah, that's it.
You had done that, the team.
Yeah, the team had done that. We'd come up with those. Yeah.
Okay, thank you, everyone. Thank you, Nishat.